My guest this week is Bob Bert. Bob is a musician, artist, photographer, and writer. And as a drummer, he has been a member of the bands Sonic Youth, Pussy Galore, Chrome Cranks, Knoxville Girls, Lydia Lunch Retrovirus, and Wolf Manhattan Project, as well as being the singer and drummer in his own project Bewitched, all while touring the world and playing on over 30 albums. In 2019, Hozak published Bob's book, I'm Just the Drummer, My Time Behind Sonic Youth, Pussy Galore, Chrome Cranks, and BB Gun magazine. 2 pressings have sold out, and a possible third will be printed later this year. Bob is also a music documentary junkie and has appeared in several himself. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome the Revolutions Per Movie, Bob Bert. Hi, Bob.
Hi, Chris.
Thanks for being here.
Hey, my pleasure.
I was reading your book, and you talk about, your first show is Jay Giles.
Well, that wasn't my first show. That was my first date.
Oh, your first date. Okay, sorry. It feels like with the same person soon after you're going to see New York Dolls in Wayne County at Max's, and then you're talking about wandering into CBGB's to see Television and Patti Smith with very few people in the audience. I mean, what did that feel like? Was your head just split open?
Well, of course, looking back on things, it means more than when it actually happens. But
of course.
I'm very fortunate to grow up right outside of New York City and became a music fan very early on. And, like I said in my book, right next to the town where I grew up, which was called Clifton, there was Passaic. And Passaic had this one area where there was 3 like old theaters that mostly showed pornography, but then they started having concerts. And this one place, the Montauk Theater, me and a bunch of high school friends, and we're talking, I graduated high school in 1973. So we went to see Pink Floyd, which was like at their Ummagumma period. And it was a bunch of high school friends, and we were like in the 3rd row, and we took mescaline, and we were passing around this giant ceramic bottle of Lancer's wine, and that was really cool because they were still like doing really tripped out music, and they actually had like speakers on the ceiling. So at one point, they had like footsteps, and it actually felt like someone was like stomping on you. And then not that long after that, or before, I don't even remember the time period, but I went to see Alice Cooper at the Central Theater, and that was the Love It to Death tour. And it was really cool because, back then all the concerts were like late shows and early shows. So I went to the early show, and there wasn't that many people there. So they allowed the people to stay through to the late show. And so I stayed.
That's cool.
Stayed through both shows. And then at one point in time, they just opened the doors to the street, and people kept wandering in. And so I think he even still does it today. But back then he had that shtick where he had a sword full of dollar bills, and he was taking them off and like throwing them into the crowd. And all these homeless people were like beating each other up trying to get this money. And it was just hysterical and something I'll never forget. And then not long after that, the Capitol Theater opened up, which was, they had concerts every day of the week for years. And that was opening night that I went on my first date at 16 to see the Jay Giles Band, Humble Pie, and I think Frampton's Camel.
So then making the switch to going into like tiny clubs, how were you finding out about Max's? Were you just reading about it in the magazines? Was it just part of the culture?
Yeah, even back then, the Village Voice was like my Bible. You'd get it on Wednesday, right, and you would plan out your whole week. Oh, I'll go see Patti tonight, this night. Oh, Ross on Roland Kirk is playing at the Vanguard tomorrow night. Oh, let's go see William Burroughs read. And so, yeah, the first time I went to Max's, a bunch of high school kids, we went to see, and back then the drinking age was 18. And so we were underage and we made fake IDs, and we went to Max's to see Dan Hicks and his Hot Licks. And when we got there, no one asked for any ID, and the first thing I thought of was like, I could have saw the Velvet Underground a week ago, you know. So,
Oh God.
so,
Wow.
so that was my first trip to Max's, and then I went back. My girlfriend, my first girlfriend, she was kind of like not out yet, but she ended up being, gay, and we just, when I first saw the New York Dolls record cover in the store, I didn't care what the music was like. I just had to have that record, and of course
Sure.
it's great. And so we went to see them at Max's, and it was just extremely loud. But once I started going to clubs, that was like, after her, we used to go see Wayne County and the Backstreet Boys, which was like an outrageous rock show, and all that early kind of glam stuff, like the Stilettos and the Harlots of 42nd Street. So yeah, I
Right.
just started just going to clubs, and I mean, I grew up like 10 miles out of New York City. So as soon as I was like 13 or 14, I was hitchhiking into the city, roaming around, buying a bottle of wine because no one asked anyone for ID back then. I mean, it was a whole different world back then. And so, yeah, I mean, I was just always a music fan, always started going to concerts. The thought of being a musician wasn't even in my mind back then, but, that eventually happened.
It's so funny. I had a record store owner who would give me the Village Voice, the New York Rockers when he was done with them, Slash, and I just would read, being this kid on the West Coast. Oh, John Sex is playing somewhere, and Flesh Tones, and Patti, and all this stuff, and I couldn't handle it.
Huh.
That so much was happening, and I would just try to imagine, like, well, what's the Peppermint Lounge like? What's Danceteria like?
Yeah.
I was always very jealous of getting the Village Voice and looking through it because it just seemed like an embarrassment of riches.
Yeah, and I was totally a magazine junkie. Like, yeah, New York Rocker. I mean, that's where I first read about Sonic Youth,
Right.
and rock scene especially, which we'll get to later when we're talking about the movie, because that was a big part of his life, Danny. And so yeah, I mean, I was just it was. I mean, looking back, it was just such a great time. Just like cruise in, and these shows, back then were like $2 or $3 to get in, and we just I went to CBGB's like 4 times a week. I saw the first shows of everybody.
I have some naive questions for you too, and we're going to get into talking about Danny Says, the documentary about Danny Fields, in a moment here. But Lydia Lunch, in the foreword of your book, says that, Bob has always been a champion of other musicians, photographers, and filmmakers, as previously illustrated in the fantastic BB Gun magazine, a labor of love if ever there was. And Danny Fields' approach of
Right.
being a fan was never get excited about anything. He says it. He's like, I learned from Warhol, be uncool about everything. Don't be phased. But I feel like you and I are very like hyper excited, wanting to share. I feel that when I read, BB Gun magazine, the reprints that you have in this thing is like you are still a fan.
First and foremost, I mean, yeah, I mean, and I think you could say that about a good number of musicians, and artists. That's how you get started, is just like admiring everything else. I mean, I as it says in my book, when I was like in high school, we went on a field trip to see the Andy Warhol retrospect at the Whitney Museum, and I was just like, like while everyone else in the suburbs was dreaming about, being a cheerleader or a football star or something, I just said, man, I wish I was born earlier so I could have hung out at the factory. Then of course, as time goes on and I learned everything about it, it's just like, yeah, I didn't really need to be around a bunch of speed freak, insane people, but I was just so entranced with that world. And so, I also became a Lou Reed fan from early on. So it's like, and Lou Reed and Patti Smith were so great because not only was I a fan of their music, but everything they said. They turned me on to so many books or films or
Right.
whatever. The first time I even heard of Bob Marley was on Patti Smith's t-shirt. So
Right.
so it's like very, very like learning from these people that you look up to.
So when you were putting BB Gun magazine together, were there other zines or magazines that had influenced how you wanted to approach?
Um, I just wanted it to be fun. And, you know, I mean, the biggest influence was the statement that Warhol made when he started Interview magazine. Like, yeah, let's start a magazine. We'll get invited to places. We'll get all, with a music zine. I was getting like, 20 CDs in the mail a day, and I would take the good ones and sell the bad ones. And it opened up a lot of doors. And it was a lot of work. And I was, putting my wife to computers were just kind of coming upon the scene, when we
Hmm.
started. The first two or three issues were all, paste up. It wasn't until later on when it got a little bit slicker. I think it was, like like five, six, and seven. That was all computer, but um, but yeah, and so we just kind of got into it, and it gave us something to do together, and because she knew all the technical stuff, and she would get all the ads, and we would make sure we got enough ads that would cover the printing, and people seemed to really dig it, and back then there were plenty of places to sell it.
You talked about, oh, a week ago I could have seen the Velvet Underground. Were there certain bands that you just heard about but you missed out on that like maybe people never heard about from the scene?
Well, I think all the really important bands got documented pretty well, but there's a
Okay.
couple like the Magic Tramps, and I'm good friends with Sesu Coleman, the drummer from that band, and like they never really got any music out there, but they're the ones that actually built the stage of CBGB. I know like television gets all this credit, but I just got this book and I didn't start reading it yet. It's like we built the stage so we get to play or something like that. And
That's a great title.
yeah, and it's actually going to be like four books altogether. And I didn't even realize it because I bought it, and the guy wrote, I posted something about it, and the guy who wrote it wrote me. He's just like, "Don't buy the second one. Don't you remember I interviewed you for it?" I was like, "Okay," but but they were talking about it before it was even called CBGB. They walked by and said to Hilly, like, if we build the stage, can we play here? And they actually, he said yes. So they went out and like stole a bunch of plywood from the garbage and like threw together this stage, and but they were never really properly recorded and documented and released. But it was like, Eric Emerson, who was part of the Warhol scene, and
Hmm.
he's the one that like stopped production on the first Velvet Underground album because his picture was on the back
Oh,
cover.
right. Okay, that's him. Okay.
So and I mean, this I saw the Stilettos and they were good. They ended up, being Debbie Harry and Chris Stein and Fred Smith, so they've moved on to do better things. And as far as like the later scene, there's a couple bands that I used to go see and I really liked that didn't really make that much headway. And one of them was the Revlons, who they've been reissued in recent times. In fact, Ozak out of Chicago just put out their album, and they also put out Neon Leon, who was always playing around back then, and the Erasers. I was a big fan of the Erasers.
Well, speaking of building stages, I wanted to ask you about building your drum set for Pussy Galore. I was so excited to finally see some version of that when you came through town with John Spencer and the Hitmakers. But like, what went into your decision of making it that way?
Pussy Galore was John's trip, although we all kind of contributed. So I left Sonic Youth, And then I was floundering around. I made this side project, Bewitched 12-inch, and then one night I went to this cat club. It was like the 2 o'clock in the morning show of Einstürmste Neubauten, and I was standing there, and I was talking to Kim and Thurston, and I just casually said, "Hey, kind of getting itchy to play again. Do you know of any good bands?" And they said, "Well, this band just moved to town from DC called Pussy Galore," and they were standing like about 10 feet away. So
Sure.
I went over and introduced them. They were all like, Christina was 19, John was 21, and I think Julie was like 20, and they all had on like brand new leather jackets that they bought at Trash and Vaudeville, and their hair was dyed black. And and I introduced myself, and then about a week later, I was standing out in front of CBGB, and John came over and handed me a copy of Groovy Hate Fuck, which they had just released themselves.
Right.
And I just said, "Oh, are you guys looking for a drummer?" And John wrote his number down, and that was that. So the very first rehearsal, I was just playing drums, and they had another guy playing metal percussion.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was John's idea to combine the two elements into one. So we built the kit, and back then, I live in Hoboken, New Jersey, and back then there was actually a junkyard still there, which is hard to imagine today because it's all gentrified. But there was a junkyard, and they had like car gas tanks like stacked to the ceiling. So we put together the kit, which was a car gas tank on top of the bass drum, and then the car spring, and then there was the metal snare drum, and then I had a regular floor tom and cymbals and hi-hat. So I had a drumstick in one hand and a metal rod in the other, and that was that. And then we just started playing like that. And then
Does that take it out on your body to play something like that versus a traditional drum set?
Yeah, and your body and your ears.
Yeah.
I was especially, with this last round with the hit makers. I played with 200. Well, both me and Sam played 221 shows altogether.
Wow.
And I mean, when I was in Pussy Galore, I was like 30, and now I'm close to 70. So it was a bit more difficult, but but the fact that in the hit makers, I was just kind of just kind of flourishing things, and
Sure.
whereas Pussy Galore was like full on 30 songs nonstop.
Yeah. Well, I was so excited to hear NYC 1999 live for a first time. I was like,
Yeah.
The film we're talking about is Danny Says, which was directed by Brendan Toller. So much of Danny's life is chance. And what you just mentioned is chance. Like, oh, I was just across the room and they're like, hey, there's a band over there. And then I see Sonic Youth needs a drummer in some random magazine. So much of life, especially in the arts, is chance and just meeting fellow souls.
Especially with me, because I don't even think I'm that great of a drummer, but it's just like I just knew what I wanted to be in to deal with, So it's just like, yeah, that was like, because like I feel like that was one of my best accomplishments, was like coming out of Sonic Youth and then being in another band, which at the time was just as well known as Sonic Youth.
Yeah, definitely. So when did you become aware of Danny Fields in the scene?
I knew his name, and I was very aware of him. And, because, I mean, the Stooges and the MC5.
Yeah.
That says it all right there. And that's just a small element of what he's been around. And so I always knew who he was, but it's really funny because in 1977, I went to see this show at the Bottom Line. It was Brian Ferry was headlining, the opening bands were the Talking Heads and the Feelies. And I had brought my camera because I was playing around with photography, and I was taking classes at the School of Visual Arts in New York. And that night, I took my greatest photos. I got a great photo of Debbie Harry. I got a great photo. They're all in the book, and so I took this picture of Lou Reed and some guy walking out, and they got their arms around each other. And it wasn't until like, oh, probably 10 years later, or I probably didn't even think about it, but I didn't realize it was Danny Fields until much later. And then that photo ended up getting into the movie. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, the film is really beautifully made. I mean, it's mostly archival interviews with Danny throughout, the later part of his life. He loved recording phone conversations with Lou Reed and Iggy Pop. And once in a while, there's somebody who comes in to talk about him, but mostly it's Danny telling his story from being a child to like being a teenager hanging out with Nina Simone. He's just like, again, just there, right? And she's young and nervous and is like, oh, I'm not that good. And they're like, no, you're great. Just the way he tells his stories is so, oh, well, Andy, then,
When he's talking to Jonathan Richman, and Jonathan's like, I want to be a rock star. And then he's like, you can't say that.
Yeah, Jonathan Richman at one point is bugging Iggy Pop. He's like, I got so much to tell you. And Iggy's like, well, I'll tell you from the stage, And then, Jonathan Richman's like, I want to be a rock star. And Danny's like, you can't say that. And Jonathan Richman's like, why not? Why not? And it's just like, it sums up all these personalities so beautifully. Everybody has such respect for each other.
Yeah.
And what Danny was trying to do really early, getting involved with the Andy Warhol scene in such a funny way where basically one of Andy's worshipers was basically crying and screaming on the floor and being like, I'm going to kill myself. Why don't you love me? And, Andy and Gerard are basically ignoring her. She starts climbing out the window and Danny goes over and pulls her off and is like kind of cradling her. And their words to him were basically like, oh,
we wanted her to jump.
And right then, that's when he was like, I need to play it. I need to play down any excitement about this. And you get that feeling from him in these interviews. He's so in love with music and in love with personalities, but he has that gear that just smushes it down.
And what he had to deal with, with Jim Morrison and Nico and Iggy, and it's just like, oh, the guy deserves a Pulitzer Prize, and it's amazing that he's still around.
84 years old right now. It's incredible.
Yeah.
You think of people being in the right place at the right time. He was, but at the same time, he was like, I was working for Liquor Store Magazine, before I started writing for like teen magazines.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he had this like really amazing glimpse into the future of art and music and performance and literature, and had this weird split between like writing, for 16 magazine and then also trying to bring something that's so unlikely into the culture.
I love the part where it's at the beginning when he's working for those magazines, when he puts on the cover of the magazine about John Lennon saying that they were bigger than Jesus Christ, and Paul McCartney using the N-word and whatnot, and it's just like, I mean, I was alive, so I remember when all that stuff happened. So just to hear that, and then it's just like, and then like a few years later, he's sitting there with Paul McCartney, and he's just like, oh, you remember when that happened? Oh, that was me.
Yeah, and Paul's like, yeah, because he befriended Linda Eastman pretty early on. There's a great segment where he goes with a photographer to see the Rolling Stones, and they're going to be on a boat, but that boat has already left. And then his competition, Gloria Stevens from 16 Magazine, shows up. And this guy in this little boat is like, hey, for $20, I'll take you over to the big boat so you can get on. And he's like, well, you want to go halves? And she says, I wouldn't pay 20 cents for the Rolling Stones, and gets back and goes away. And Danny does it, and then he befriends Linda Eastman, right, the photographer. It's just like those things where of course he's going to get in the small boat and go.
Yep.
for $20, you know. He wanted to be where the action was.
Yeah, and he was.
Was there anyone in the era of, you know, Sonic Youth and Pussy Galore that kind of filled a gap like Danny Fields for the scene?
No.
Right.
Yeah.
I kind of wondered that too.
Sonic, in a way, Gerard Kozloy kind of helped out Sonic Youth at the beginning.
Sure.
But, I don't know. I just, as iconic as Sonic Youth and Pussy Galore have become, they're not MC5 and the Stooges.
Right. Did you get to see the Stooges?
Just on their reunion.
Right.
I saw a few of those shows. In fact, the only time I went to one of those All Tomorrow's parties was in upstate New York. I just went up there for the day, and I saw that triple bill of the Stooges doing Raw Power with James Williamson, and then Mudhoney and the Scientists.
Right.
And that was like
amazing.
I've seen some great triple bills in my life, but that was amazing.
Oh, God, I would have loved to have seen that. I saw the Scientists with Mudhoney on that tour. Incredible. I never thought I'd see the Scientists.
Yeah.
Blew me away. I saw one of the most incredible things. Is the lead guitar player Kim? Is that his name? I believe.
Kim Salmon, yeah.
Yeah.
He's the main
First
guy.
song, string breaks. He plays, puts a string on while playing still. Doesn't stop. Tunes it up. I'd never seen anyone like string a guitar and still play a song at the same time instead of like...
I have, and it was like it was Fred Cole from Dead Moon.
Of course. Yeah, that makes sense.
It was amazing. When I was in the Chrome Cranks in the 90s, we did a bunch of shows in Europe with Dead Moon, and the very first show we were going to do with them, we had to bail out. We got a flat tire on the way to the show, so we got there too late, and Dead Moon just walked on, so we didn't get, and it was amazing because I knew about them, but I didn't know that much about them. But there was like 1,000 people. They knew every word to every song, and that was exactly. Fred broke a string in a song and changed it without missing a beat. It was so
like,
awesome. Yeah, those guys, that's the best thing to come out of the Portland area, in my opinion.
Oh my God, yeah. And again, it's one of those things that didn't take for granted, but definitely it was just, it's just like, yeah, they're playing 2 times a month. That's a Satyricon, because there's not enough bands to go around,
Yeah.
You look at those old calendars and you're like, all right, Miracle Workers are playing twice, Dharma Bums are playing twice, Poison Idea.
I opened for them at the Satyricon.
Yeah.
Probably the Chrome Cranks, I think. I'm not sure.
One of the things I didn't know about Danny was that he was a DJ at WFMU.
Yeah.
I just wanted to talk about like how much of part WFMU played in your life.
I think it plays into it more now than it did then. Yeah, I wasn't, back when he was a DJ on FMU, I was probably just listening to the regular FM stations and might not have, and sometimes some other college radio stations. But, now that nowadays I know a lot of the DJs there. I listen to, Todd O'Phonics show every Saturday.
Yeah, of course. Well, and this is around the time he's being hired by Elektra, bringing in like the David Peel album, I Want to Get High, 1968, and then discovering the MC5 and their little baby brother band, the Stooges. This part of the film always makes me tear up. Seeing any footage of the Stooges or the MC5 makes me cry because it's so beautiful and powerful and fun. And just watching like the MC5 kick in fast motion together is like, I can never get tired of it.
And that MC5 documentary is another great one. And it's just,
I know.
It's hard to see because it got pulled down.
Yeah, Cliff Skurlock from the Flaming Lips and Gruff Rhys's band chose to do that one. It's such a shame. I mean, you can find it out there. It's floating around. I just love that he said everything in New York was a feat, but this was like blood, lust, sweat, cum, and vigor. He just wanted something that was, he just needed that energy. And I can only imagine Danny like seeing them.
He said he he fell in love with them before he even saw them as he was walking down the hall, you know.
Yeah. Well, and like a lot of us, even just seeing a photograph of something or reading about it before you even hear anything was often our introduction to things. I mean, I read about Sonic Youth before hearing it, you know, and you would create your own magic. So I love things like this where, you know, Danny is seeing like, oh, they've got this White Panther movement and they've got, you know, they all live together and they've got this crazy manager with all of this, you know, political leanings. And God, I can only imagine what he must have felt like. It was just his.
Yeah. And he knew that, you know, one day it would, you know, it had legs, you know, because, you know, at the time, you know, the Stooges went right into the bargain bin, and so did the MC5.
Could you find those records easily at the time?
I remember I when I was in junior high school, me and my friend used to shoplift records, and MC5 album was one of them. And I remember seeing the Stooges album cover, and I was always intrigued, but it maybe took me a while before I actually caught on to it. And, you know, to this day, Funhouse to me is like the best rock and roll album ever made. So.
Yeah, I remember that feeling of picking things up and putting them down again, not knowing my loyalty to this thing yet. Yeah. Maybe sometimes I'd seen it a little too much, that it made me be like, maybe no one wants to have this, you know? Which...
Right. Well, that was for me. That was Rock Scene magazine that Danny was also a part of.
Right.
I would, you know, once a month, I would walk a mile to this magazine store that carried it, and I would, you know, and there it's just like thumbing through it. It's like, oh, you know, David Johansen having dinner with Joey Ramone. It's just like, it was all like nothing really about the music, but it's just like created this world that was totally intriguing, you know.
Right.
And it was so cool because back then you go to New York and you see all these people walking around.
He signs the MC5 for $20,000, and then Elektra says, and offer the Stooges $5,000. He's like, $5,000, and they're like, killer, great, let's do it. They sign it up.
And meanwhile, the check went to John Sinclair.
Exactly. Well, you know,
he's just like, yeah, I think 25,000. I'm just like,
yeah. And they immediately, you know, the MC5, you know, there's the amazing gatefold messaging that they have on it, you know, about smoking dope, fucking in the streets.
Yeah.
It's pulled from this department store, Hudson's, which was a big chain at the time in the Midwest. The MC5, without telling Elektra, put a full page ad in all the, you know, weekly hippie free magazines at the time that says fuck Hudson's with the big Elektra symbol on it. And I just love Danny talking about it. He's like, oh no, you guys can't do that. You can't. He's just, I could just imagine being on the phone with him. I would love to hear Danny Fields raise his voice in anger, but it just seems more than anything else, it's like this kind of defeated, like, oh no, you guys, come on. Over and over again, whether he's talking about the Stooges or Jonathan Richman or the Ramones. It's like such a classic manager metaphor in a way, just like always being put out by these bands. So, of course, they get kicked off Elektra, but I am with you in terms of the Stooges, and there's that amazing conversation that Danny tapes with Iggy talking about the Funhouse sessions, and he's like, it's right up there with the Stones and the Doors. Kids are going to flip out. You can listen to it on the lowest volume, and it still sounds like the walls are going to be caved in. And, of course, doesn't happen, you know, and this is kind of the role for Danny as he discovered all these amazing things that in hindsight influenced everyone, all of us, culture, music, filmmakers, so many artists. but he kind of never gave up. I thought it was kind of amazing that he just always would kind of move on to the next thing.
Well, yeah, he went from there to all that to, managing the Ramones. And have you ever heard that box that Rhino put out years
Yes.
ago of all the Funhouse sessions? It's so funny because there's like, say like Loose, there's like 30 versions of it.
Yes.
And they all rip musically, but the lyrics are ridiculous until it gets to like the last two. He's like, I'm riding on a big hot dog.
Yeah, he doesn't mention that to Danny. By that point, they're sealed up. But yeah, I just his patience and his love. I think that's the word. He loves these bands. He loves these people, and I think it's a very endearing documentary that way. It's really sweet.
And they all seem to love him. There's so many photos where he's like, hanging with Bowie and whoever, like everybody in the world, and he's just like there with a big smile on his face. And
yeah, he gets Iggy and Bowie together. Iggy doesn't want to leave the house, and Danny's like, "You should really go meet David. He wants to meet you." Okay, it's like he's the guy, and that he has some low periods where he's, having to work for Steve Paul, who managed the Winter Brothers. And he's like, "Oh, what could be better than two albino brothers?" He's
playing
like
blues.
Yeah, he's like, "Oh, da 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 da." It's just like I could listen to Danny sing the greats of the Winter Brothers forever. It was amazing.
Well, he even trashes the Beatles.
Yeah, totally. But it was around this time also that, he's left Elektra, but he's fallen in love with Jonathan Richman. He was like saying he was stealing towels that Jerry and Eddie set on so that he could just have them. He was just, again, in love. I'm really shocked there's not a Jonathan Richman documentary yet.
Well, that Velvet Underground documentary that Todd Haynes made, Jonathan is such a big part of that. And it's so great to hear him, like, he was like, they're friends, and he was always backstage, and he was, probably a teenager. And he was like, getting tips from like Lou Reed and Sterling Morrison. And then he was like, when he talks about how, all of a sudden John Cale's gone and Doug Yule is there, and he starts talking all about that. I mean, Jonathan Richman, he's amazing.
Yeah.
Nothing. He'll never top that first Modern Lovers album. In fact, a lot of things will never top that first Modern Lovers album. That's probably in my top 5, or definitely top 10 of all time.
It's in my top 5.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So, it is surprising there hasn't been a documentary about him, and it would be very entertaining.
Yeah, he's so heartfelt. Criterion put out the Velvet Underground documentary, and they had some extras. They had like a 15-minute excerpt of Jonathan Richman footage they didn't use. But at the end, his eyes are full of tears. He's like, if there's one word I would like to say about the Velvet Underground, it's gratitude. It's gratitude. He's so thankful. He's like, they took the time with this little kid who was just looking around and trying to figure out, I see the instruments, but they're making another sound together that's not on the stage.
Yeah, like overtones.
Again, it also really speaks to the band, their trajectory, and Lou's stories, of just, suffers no fools, but to also slow down and be so gentle with someone. I would just love to see it. I worked with Jonathan on a charity album once, and he came through town, and we went to his favorite restaurant in town, which was Mediterranean food. He went to play Seattle. 2 days later, he calls me. He's like, "Hey, you want to go eat lunch?" I'm like, "Sure." He's like, "We went to the same place, had the same food, had almost the same conversation." It was so funny. I was like, this is Jonathan Richman. He's a total sweetie. But yeah, he couldn't, again, got John Cale involved, couldn't get anything off the ground, couldn't get anyone interested. And by this point, Jonathan Richman's disinterested. So He leaves that.
Yeah, he got Elektra to put out Nico album with John Cale producing it.
And it's amazing that Jack Holzman is like, well, it's not that expensive to make. Let's see what happens. It's such an incredible time where, you could
Yeah,
put out
yeah.
the, Chelsea Girls and Marble Index and let it stand.
And it's funny. A couple of years ago, Danny put out a book of his photos of the Ramones, and I've been in two bands, and I'm really good friends with Kid Congo Powers. And Kid Congo, when he was a teenager, he was the president of the Ramones fan club. So there's all these pictures of like, all those pictures around the Tropicana pool, especially that amazing photo of Dee Dee wearing the Sugar Daddy shirt and in his underwear. And Kid was there. He was like 2 feet away. There's all these pictures where this very young Kid Congo is standing like right by the Ramones. It's like amazing.
Do you remember where you first heard about the Ramones?
Yeah, I mean, I went to see them. There was talk about them, so I went to see them at CBGB's. And the very first time I saw them, I wasn't that impressed. I said, "Oh, this just sounds like David Peel fronting a rock band." And then not that long after that, their first album came out, and a friend played it, and I was just like, okay. And I went back and saw them a bunch of times. In fact, the first time I saw the Cramps, they were opening for the Ramones, and
Wow.
I never had heard of them. I said, "Oh, that's a great name." And so I saw the Cramps. Miriam Lina was still playing drums, and so yeah, I pretty much lived at CBGB's, and I was just this, stoner kid from New Jersey. I didn't know anyone from the scene or anything like that. I just would just go there, and you'd be like roll joints on the table and watch these great bands from a few feet away. I was actually there. One night I went to see Television play, and so I'm standing by the bar, and Lou Reed comes walking in. And it just so happened that we pretty much had the same outfit on, which was like a blue t-shirt and a leather jacket. And he just looked at me and like nodded. And so I was such a big fan. So I followed him up to the front, and I sat like, right on the table next to him. I was like watching his every move. And so I actually, after Television got done playing, from 2 feet away, I actually witnessed Tom Verlaine handing Lou Reed the Little Johnny Jewel 7-inch that they just put out
Oh
themselves.
my God.
And then I was telling that story over the years, and someone said, "Yeah, that's the same night that Tom realized that Lou had a tape recorder under his jacket, and he taped the set. And Tom was pissed off, and he like took the tape from him or something." So Lou was going to see these bands and recording them. Probably trying to get some ideas.
I know, that's amazing. There's a great, again, recorded on cassette moment between Danny and Lou. He's playing the Ramones for
yeah, I love that.
And he's like, "Oh my God, without a doubt, this is the greatest thing you've ever played me." He's so charmed. He's just on cloud nine listening to the Ramones.
Oh yeah, he's like, "They hit the nail on the head. This is so much better than Patti or me even."
Yeah, I know, it's so sweet. And it made me realize that I think Danny could get people to just kind of come down a bit and maybe not have to play the game so much with him, Yeah. So I really love that Danny had captured a lot of that. Do you have some shows that were just top of the pyramid in terms of what you saw at CBGB's, and maybe some that you were like, wow, that did not lift off at all, but I was so excited to see, and it didn't take off?
I remember I went to see the Ramones, and Suicide was opening up, and I later heard the whole story when I interviewed Alan Vega, but they were just on for a really long time, and I was with a bunch of my friends. I didn't like mind it that much, but my friends were just like, "Oh God, this is unbearable," blah blah
Right.
blah blah blah. This is the worst shit I've ever heard, and of course, once their album came out, I was just like, "Oh yeah, they're the greatest band ever."
Yep.
So But I remember I was interviewing. I got hired to interview Suicide to write the liner notes for the Blast first re-release of their second album, and I was interviewing Alan and Martin, and I was telling Alan about that show. He goes, "Oh yeah," he goes, I remember that night." He said, "The Ramones earlier in the night were opening for Blue Oyster Cult out in Long Island, and they couldn't get back to the club in time, and so Hilly just told us to stay. He wouldn't let us get off the stage until the Ramones showed up. So it was just like, you know, they were driving everyone crazy for a really long time. But I pretty much enjoyed it all. I really liked the Tough Darts when Robert Gordon was in them.
Sure.
Um, we used to go see them all the time. One of the only bands that I loved back then that I don't really care about now was the Talking Heads as a three-piece. They were so good. They were so minimal.
Yeah.
Their audience at CBGB's was different. It had like more like arty people and drag queens. It was a little bit cooler of a crowd. Yeah, and then then as time went on, I mean, I still like their first few albums, but
Right.
yeah,
They became something else.
they're one of those bands that just kept expanding and expanding. And
Yeah. There's that Super 8 film that has like, television and early Talking Heads and Tough Darts and Marbles and
Blank Generation by Amos Poe.
yeah, that's such a great little insight into
Yeah.
just how small it was and how underlit it was. I just love it. And again, yeah, I'd never heard of some of the bands before.
There was this club on 23rd Street called Mothers, and there's like some clips in that film from that place. It's so weird because like the ceiling is like a half a foot higher than like Richard Hell's head.
Oh my God. Well, Danny does his best with the Ramones again, and he managed them for quite a while, but just couldn't get them as big as he wanted them to be, but he did bring them over to the UK, in 75, I believe.
Yeah.
And, that's such an incredible moment.
And you can't blame him. And it's kind of like just the way it happened. And it's like he says in the film, once the Sex Pistols came out, they got all the attention. It kind of gave the word punk a bad name.
Right.
As time went on, I mean, the Ramones, ended up playing something like 4,000 shows or whatever.
Well, everything he touched, it has legacy, Nico, Stooges, Ramones, MC5, Jonathan Richman. It's like undeniable.
David Peel.
Well, that seemed like more of like, he's like, hey, maybe this will work.
All these beer drinking albums. I just want to say that Brendan Toller did a great job. The one reason I picked this movie to talk to you about was because a lot of people might not know who he is. Like most music docs have the band's name in the title, and it's like, oh, Danny Fields, like they might not know, and yet he is more a part of counterculture music than anybody. He like what he did. I mean, what if the Stooges and the MC5 albums never came out? Would there be a punk rock? I mean, the Ramones formed because they were four misfits. The only thing they had in common was that they liked the Stooges.
Right.
So,
and you look at these things, they do seem really futuristic. Like you watch the Ramones argue on stage, and it's like, what am I looking at? Even now, I'm like, how did this happen? It's so weird. Joey Ramone as the front man. It's just like, Dee Dee writing all these amazing songs. It's just full of surprises.
Oh yeah, so it's so funny, and it's just, I mean, it's just the fact that Johnny and Joey didn't speak to each other for like 10 years and they still existed.
Yeah.
How do you make albums with someone that you're not talking to? And and so there was all these really crazy stories. It's amazing that they're all gone, for one thing. And there's this book written by Monty Melnick, who is their road manager from day one until the end. And there's this one story in there where they're on tour and they stop and they're at a roadside like 7-Eleven or something, and the Ramones are all roaming around the store, and Monty's up at the counter, and the woman behind the counter says, it's really great what you're doing for these, special need.
And he's like, I know. Yes,
Yeah.
thank you. He's like,
You
exactly.
have no idea.
Well, at the end of every interview, I ask the same question, but I tailor it depending on the film we're talking about. So on a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being the lowest and 10 being the highest, how many eye rolls from Danny Fields from across the room do you give this movie?
Oh, if it's 10 out of 10, I give it 10. It's just like,
Yeah.
like, well, the start of this whole thing with you is just we're both fans of music docs, and there's so many good ones. And even recently, I mean, the birthday party one is really good. And I mean, music docs are great because even if you're not the biggest fan, sometimes you'll watch it and then you become a fan, and
Oh, totally.
and so and it's always funny when you watch them. It's kind of like when you're reading music bios and stuff too. While you're reading it or watching the film, as soon as it's done, you just go put on those records again, but like I said, I mean, not that many people probably realize who Danny is, and they should. And I thought Brendan did a really great job, and and it was funny because I knew it was being made. I might have even contributed money, and I sent them that one picture, and then one night there was a screening of it at the at a movie theater in Manhattan, the IFC theater. Is that it? Yeah. Okay. So it was sold out, and I just like posted on Facebook, man, I'd really like to get in to see this film. And Maggie Vale?
Yeah.
Yeah. She saw that when I posted, and she just wrote Brendan Toller, and I didn't really know him then. And so he so he wrote me and said, yeah, come on by. So then I go to the theater, I'm waiting in line, and he comes right up to me, and I was like, my first impression was like, my God, you're so young. How did you make this amazing film about Danny? I didn't see it yet, but about Danny Fields, and then I saw it again, a special screening at the Roxy Hotel, and at that one it was cool because I think Danny spoke, and they gave out free T-shirts with the picture of Dee Dee Ramone, the Sugar Daddy.
Oh, wow.
Which was one of those white T-shirts that was just so soft that I still have it, but there's like threads. It's like two holes holding together of a T-shirt.
Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah, I would give this 10 lovingly past eye rolls across the room from Danny Fields as well. I mean,
most music docs are about one musician or one band. Here you got the Beatles, the Doors, the Stooges, the MC5, Leonard Cohen, who we didn't even mention, Judy Collins, David. The list goes on. He's just like, it was just no music doc covers so much and makes it so enjoyable.
It's so fun. It's so fun. Like the scene where he's with Lisa Robinson and Aerosmith shows up, and they're like, ooh, he wore his clothes from the stage. It's just like so many moments like that are just, you would have one of those in a movie and you'd be like, oh, you got to see this thing. Yeah. But it's so full of charm.
How about the Ramones, they keep bugging me. What are they, a Spanish band? Oh, you go see them, Lisa. I don't want to go see them.
Oh, God. Yeah, very charmed very lovely. And I just really appreciated that Brendan was able to put together something that was such a love letter to somebody who was in love with music.
Yeah.
And changed the world.
Definitely. Changed my world anyway.
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you so much, Bob. It's been great to see you. I appreciate this.
Thanks, Chris.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to Revolutions Per Movie. We release new episodes every Thursday. We are a completely independently produced affair, so the best way to support us is to rate and review the show on your favorite podcast app and to subscribe to our Patreon over at patreon.com/revolutionspermovie, where you can get exclusive weekly bonus episodes every Sunday, as well as one-of-a-kind handmade Revolutions Per Movie goods that I send out to you. You can follow the show on social media at Revolutions Per Movie and find more information about our various guests in the episode show notes. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week. Bye!